Conservation Board, and I've worked there since 1987 when the program was founded. And with me is Oldham from the Equity Trust, and we're going to talk about housing and conservation this afternoon. I was not expecting until a couple of days ago when my colleague Jim Libby found he couldn't travel to do this. So I'm going to do the best I can. But I don't have the very best slides to show you. But all I'll do is tell you the story of how we got together. But before I launch in, and knowing it's after lunch, if anybody needs to stretch because you're just feeling sleepy, get up, jump around, do what you need to do, just try to stay awake. We'll try not to be boring. But why don't we start by going around the room and asking people to introduce themselves, and if you have a word of what you hoped you were going to get out of this session, that might help us. And how many people were at the previous session on urban agriculture? Just to show hands. Okay. So not everybody. We may be a little bit repetitious, but we'll try not to be. So why don't we just start by introduce themselves, tell us where you're from.
That I can make use of.
My name is Kurt Groves. I'm from the Anchorage Community Land Trust in Anchorage, Alaska, and I'm just here to learn about the innovative ideas that are reshaping the communities.
I'm Rebecca Lane. I'm the Executive Director of the National Co-Housing Association, and I also was on the founding board of the Lopez Community Land Trust, and I used to be a sheep farmer. So I have a lot of intersections going on here, but as co-housing is opening its arms to more affordable models and dancing with habitat and community land trusts, we're also looking at integrating agriculture. I'm very glad you're here.
Jamie Stevens, San Juan County Council, and I'm a former board member of the Lopez Community Land Trust. Our county is heavy into all of these things: affordable housing, conservation, and farmers.
Wade Patterson. I'm with the Sawmill Community Land Trust, and we have about a 1 acre parcel that we're looking to put into production in the next year, working on infrastructure right now, and just looking at the residents will help guide what format it takes, and so we're looking to feed them some good ideas.
Julie Cree and Cree Architects, and I'm also doing research at the University of Washington, studying energy demands and different styles of building using LEED or passive house or Built Green, Evergreen standards, doing a comparative study of community land trusts.
Jerry Classic from the North Missoula Community Development Corporation in Montana. We're actually heading up the creation of a statewide land trust that would do for not just housing, but conservation, ag, wildlife preservation. So trying to get a broader umbrella to maybe attract larger funders and get more support from the state.
I'm Ermina Harold from the North Missoula CDC as well, and what he said.
I'm Jeanette Hill from the Housing Resources Board on Bainbridge Island, and I'm just kind of getting a feel for what everybody else is doing.
Sure, introduce yourself.
Sorry, Sarah Harmon, Housing Colorado, Director of Advocacy, so I'm just interested in the broad range of activities.
Roberta Scher with the Tacoma Housing Authority, looking at the possibility of doing something with the CLT in Tacoma.
Barbara Corcoran, the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. I work with some community land trusts in that area and the urban agriculture.
I think tell you the story of the Housing and Conservation Coalition and the board that got created. And 25 years ago, I was an advocate working at a community action agency. It was the age of Ronald Reagan. And those of you who are old enough to remember those days know that the federal budget for housing under Reagan got cut by something like 80%. These big Section 8 new construction, substantial rehab programs came to an end. And at the same time, the only program I know of in the federal government that the Reagan folks cut more deeply than housing was the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So Vermont, which has been getting $2.5 million a year for quite a long time, went to getting $250 million a year and basically got out of the land acquisition, park development business. And there had been a number of advocates for open space who'd gone to the governor in the 80s and said, can we have a fund? And she said no. And then they got together in a second year with ag advocates and said, do we have a fund? And she said no. And they came to the affordable housing community, the low-income advocacy community, and said, you know, we ought to be able to do a stroke of business together. We think we have some things in common. What do you think about having a common coalition and a common problem? And Vermont's a small place. There's only 600,000 of us, but we didn't know each other. And we didn't know really even if we could trust each other, if we had something in common other than that there was we both had a need for funding, for resources to fill the federal gap, and a need to work together. Quite frankly, the conservation community brought the low-income community a great gift, which was that they had raised money to pay for an advocate to push legislation through, a lobbyist to push legislation through our legislature. And it was at a time in Vermont where real estate values were just skyrocketing. There was a time in 85, 86, 87 that lakefront went up 2% a month. And in general, real estate was going up 1% a month. And there was all kinds of churn going on in the real estate market. And there was huge development pressures on open space, on farmland, the dairy economy, where dairy state predominantly was such that it was really pushing farmers to sell spaghetti, divide their farms, sell off spaghetti lots, create suburbanization, which doesn't mix real well with agriculture. But it was also displacing low-income people from communities. And if you visited Stowe, Vermont, or Killington in the 70s, there were wealthy people and poor people living side by side. And by the late 80s, the poor people had been pushed out of those communities. They really became economically gated communities. And so we started talking about what it was that we had in common. And we clearly felt that the real estate market was a common problem for us. And there was a real sense that people were being displaced from their communities and displaced from their traditions. Now, most of you probably, if you think about Vermont today, you think about Bernie Sanders, and you think about what kind of reputation we have as kind of a left-wing paradise. But in fact, hunting is a constitutional right in Vermont. I mean, it's in the Vermont Constitution. And so the sense of people being displaced from their homes, from their communities, from their land, was not just a question of access to housing as a social justice issue. It was really something that kind of permeated the atmosphere. So we started getting together in the fall of '86, and we started meeting weekly, trying to figure out what did this group of low-income advocates and the green sneaker crowd, as we refer to our friends in the conservation community, have in common. And this notion of displacement from our communities, displacement from traditions, was one of the things we had to do. We began to talk about the word trust. We had one community land trust at that time that had done 2 units of housing. And we had a staff of 1.5. And we had a couple of conservation organizations that were tiny by today's standards, that were beginning to experiment with buying development rights. They were mostly accepting donations of easements from landowners because there was no capital to actually buy them. And really we focused on the word trust. And what we really found was we really needed to figure out, could we trust each other? How could we work together? And I look back at it today, and really what we did was to create what I refer to as a conspiracy of goodwill. And we created a program that has now gotten about $240 million from the state of Vermont over the last 24 years. And we've done about $1 billion worth of business in 10,000 homes and apartments, and the conservation of about 140,000 acres of agricultural land and 250,000 acres of open space, and close to 60 buildings that are historic buildings. We define historic preservation as a conservation activity that have become community centers, community use kinds of facilities, sometimes for the arts, sometimes just community gathering places, saving old town halls, things like that. as we look back on all those issues, we found one of the things that the conservation and housing community really had in common was we wanted permanent protections of resources. We didn't want temporary fixes. So that was one of our common agendas. We all wanted a community-driven process. We wanted community members to be involved in deciding what resources were to be protected, where housing ought to get built, what it ought to look like. We wanted to pick the places that were most special for protection. We also needed, all of us, capacity building support. So when we built the program, we made that an essential element that the public was going to support capacity building financially. And then finally, having worked with all kinds of federal programs, we really wanted a program that was going to be different, flexible and responsive. And we actually wrote into the statute that one of the things the Housing and Conservation Board would have to do when it awarded funds was consider the need for a timely response to unpredictable circumstances and unique opportunities or special opportunities. And what we were trying to do was to create a statutory framework where a governmental body was going to be empowered to take risk, was going to be empowered to be creative, was going to be in a situation where they would be responsive to community needs. And we took legislation to the State House in January of '87, and we, for those of you familiar with political processes, we worked it through 8 committees of the legislature in 16 weeks. Lightning speed. And we got an appropriation. We'd asked for a dedicated fund also of the property transfer tax. And our rationale was that we ought to tax transfers because the real estate market was causing our problems, and we ought to capture some of that revenue to fix the problem. We didn't get that the first year. But that, after the legislature went home, the governor had a commission on the future of Vermont. And they went all over the state, and unscripted, it was not one of those advocacy-driven things. People showed up at 7 public hearings, and they said, this housing and conservation idea, we really, really like that. It really speaks to what our community needs. And we were very lucky because the state was in surplus times. And so when they wrote their report on the future of Vermont, they said, we should give this fledgling program that had done, at that point, 3 deals, 1 housing deal and 2 conservation deals, $20 million, and we should raise the transfer tax. And there was a huge fight in the legislature over the legislation, mostly focused on Vermont's desire to also really modernize its planning laws and do planning, and ask communities to plan for housing and plan for conservation and open space and transportation. And we were kind of a side item that went through it. And when the legislature got done with the governor's proposal, we did indeed get $20 million, and we did indeed get a dedicated fund. And that really, that level of goodwill and that level of trust in an idea, and the idea that we'd be entrepreneurial and take risks on things, really led to really having the base where we could build a program. When we got started, most of the community land trusts in Vermont were ideas. There might have been a community group that was meeting as a group of volunteers in Brattleboro and Central Vermont. But as I said, one CLT had a staff of 1.5 and had done 2 houses when we were organized, and a year later they'd done 10. And people just gravitated to this thought that we could take on this dual mission. So that's a bit about our story and how we got going. One of the other issues that we had to fight about a lot in terms of this issue of trust was how would the funding that became available to us get divided? And we talked a lot about whether we should set it in statute or leave it to the board that was going to be created to divide the funds. And we finally decided that we really liked each other enough and trusted each other enough, and we had enough faith in who we'd get appointed to the board, that that all we put in the statute was to require the board to spend its proceeds in a balanced way, to prioritize dual goal projects, projects that incorporated both housing and conservation. And if any given year we choose to spend 70% of the revenue on one purpose or the other, we have to explain why to the legislature. That was where we landed. There are 2 other states that have taken similar approaches to a joint fund, Hawaii and Connecticut, but they don't have a joint board, and my understanding is what happens is, by statute, the money just gets sent out to line state agencies. Permanent affordability, I should also say, is a tenet right in our statute. That's the goal. In terms of open space and agricultural land, those are part of our purposes. We have had mixed success with dual goal projects. We mostly do historic preservation and housing together, but we've occasionally had some success in combining the 2 things. And the nonprofit CLTs and other nonprofit housing organizations that we work with have pretty well become, for most communities, their community development department. Other than Burlington, which is a town of 38,000, a big town in Vermont has a population of 8,000 to 10,000, and they don't have community development staff, or they might have one person who can focus on it part-time. And so as the movement in Vermont has matured, if you're a small rural community with community development needs, you go to the people with real estate experience, and that's the nonprofit CLTs. And so today, every time there's a fire and somebody's downtown, the first call that gets made is, can you help save this building or help us replace it? Can you help us think about it? And occasionally CLTs also get asked to think about open space needs. We have a pretty strong conservation community that usually take the lead on conservation projects, and we have national groups like TPL that are involved. But we have seen by working together, and the Housing and Conservation Coalition still meets regularly, they still lobby the legislature annually, a great cross-fertilization of ideas and a commitment by the conservation community to social justice. So for instance, this past year the Vermont Land Trust, our biggest conservation land trust, helped the food bank, the Vermont Food Bank, buy a farm. So we are producing food on a food bank farm for people in need. We are often dealing with questions of public access to open space and helping to link that to our village centers and creating ways for people to walk and recreate. So that's a bit about how the dual goals have played out over time. A couple of other things. The state of Massachusetts took a very different kind of approach, not a completely different. They passed something called the Community Preservation Act in, I think, 2000, 2001. So it's been on the books about 10 years. Their approach is a little bit different. They let communities decide whether to opt in or not and raise tax at the local level that then can be used for housing, open space, parks, historic properties.
Historic preservation and recreation.
And again, I think the advocates in Massachusetts, especially the housing advocates, were quite concerned about whether, when left just to the community, they'd ever choose affordable housing. So 10 years after the Community Preservation Act passed, there's been $925 million raised that's benefited 148 communities, 5,000 homes and apartments, 15,000 acres of open space, 2,500 historic properties, and 729 outdoor recreation fields. So in many ways, it's a different model than ours. It's locally driven completely rather than at the state level, but it's, I think, viewed as a great success.
I just add that the state does have some minimal sort of distribution requirements about that money. So, but it's 10% has to go, at least 10% has to go to housing, at least to conservation. But that gives the community a lot of room to where they put the other 70%.
So I'm going to show you a few slides quickly and then turn it over to Jim. This is southern Vermont, the Meadowy River Valley, and we bought development rights not from this fellow, but from his grand uncle in 1988, Bob Graff, a true Yankee farmer, Republican legislator, a man of few words. We did not buy this farm with an affordability option. We just bought the development rights. And about 10 years ago, we introduced into our program the opportunity to buy not just the conservation value, but to buy an affordability option, which enhanced the value of the purchase. So when it came time for the farm to transfer, young Mr. Russo, the nephew, wanted to buy the farm. He'd been leasing it and doing some things on it. And we deepened the subsidies so that he could buy it. It is now subject to an ag affordability option. Not quite the same as the community land trust model. He is, in addition to continuing the dairy, raising pumpkins, and now he's in the business of making cheese. So it's a great diversified farm.
That's not good work.
That's not
good work. You have to do
Okay.
just down there.
Okay. If you come to Vermont, and you are all invited next September, and you start your trip in Brattleboro, which is a long way from the conference, there is a great land trust there, the Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust. This is not one of their projects, but it's just adjacent to their neighborhood. This is right in downtown, and this is a hotel, an Art Deco hotel and movie theater that was built in the 30s, and the community, the family who'd run it for 60 years decided it was time to retire, and a community group, a nonprofit group, bought it. They leased the hotel out to an operator and turned the movie theater into a performing arts center that's benefiting the community. And Brattleboro has a farm at the gateway into the community that has become public open space as well. So sometimes we're not doing housing and conservation as a single deal in historic preservation, but communities are choosing to use the program to meet a variety of needs. This is a former school up in Waterbury Center. This is not far from Burlington, so maybe there'll be one of the places where there'll be a field trip. This was built as a seminary in the 1870s, I think. And 3 times in the 60s, it then became the school for the community. 3 times in the 60s, the community voted to have the building demolished. And a local guy got a hold of it in order to try to save it. He let it run into the ground, but he kept it from being demolished. And he sold it to the Community Land Trust about 7 years ago. And every time we take an old school and turn it into housing, it's just a great thing because they all have tall ceilings. In this case, the second floor was where the gymnasium was, so the ceilings are like 16 feet. So you can have a small unit that feels really, really spacious. In this building is the community's library, and in the back here is the Little League field for Waterbury Center, so there's public use of that. This is Proctorsville, Vermont, not far from where Solzhenitsyn lived when he moved to Vermont. They did not have a town meeting, and a historic building became available because it was going to be demolished. I think it's this one right here. And it got moved to the site, and a green was created. There are 4 condominiums along the side there that are home ownership. The other buildings are rental, and okay, we'll move to a different project now. And then finally, this is Dalton Drive at 40th and Allen. This is right next door to Burlington. 40th and Allen was once a place for the armed forces, and there's an officer's row that you can see in the background there. We turned that into 60 condominiums, 29 or 70 condominiums, 29 of which are permanently affordable and controlled by the Champlain Housing Trust. The balance are market rate condos. There's also an apartment, I think an 8 or 12 unit apartment complex that was built with AQUA funds for people with AIDS. And then 19 acres of the parade grounds, which back in the 80s, a developer wanted to turn into a shopping mall, and that turned into permanent open space for the community, all as one deal. So those are a few of the kinds of things that we've been trying to do in terms of achieving multiple goals in Vermont. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim, unless you want to stop and ask me a couple questions. Okay, Jim. Thanks. I'm not going to sign on the email. So if I stand here, I'm blocking anyone's view. Am I right in the middle for you?
A little bit, but that's fine.
Okay. We can move down. We couldn't figure out how to get this to work remotely. So one reason, so this is following the small state. You get to hear from the small nonprofit. The state looks awfully big. But so I'm the director of Equity Trust. We're based in Massachusetts. And we've been working on issues of land reform for the last 20 years, the organization has. It was founded by Chuck Mathai, who many of you will probably recognize his name as an early proponent of the community land trust and as well community loan funds. Equity Trust does a number of different things. We're a small lender, so those of you who have small CLT projects should be aware that we're available as a resource. But I'm going to focus on our farm work. And I'm really excited this year seeing the various sessions, and that was one of the reasons I was asking Gus to find out how many of you were at the Urban Ag talk earlier, because hearing, I really like what Greg Rosenberg says. I won't read it to you, but he spoke very eloquently at that session, but he's written about this too, that the idea that the community land trust, the concept is so much bigger than housing. Housing is great, it's wonderful, and we absolutely need it. But what a wonderful model that we can have for preserving, for dealing with those other needs we have, giving ourselves the food we need to eat, and the community services and the economic opportunities. So his message that I want to echo is, let's expand it. Let's use it. We've got this tool. Let's use it to its fullest form. And so I think it's exciting to hear the new business models, the urban agriculture, and what I'm going to be talking about is what we've been doing around farmland preservation. And it's fun for me to get to present to you folks about CLT people about the work we do with preserving farms for farmland, because we know my audience frequently is folks in the conservation world, and they bring a lot of skills and knowledge and experience to the table, but it's a different set. And some of the stuff that make people in that world look at me cross-eyed and sort of question, what are you talking about, is the stuff that the CLT people really know well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, so this is a new way for me to do this presentation. So I'm going to go quickly through a lot of slides and just tell a couple of stories that hopefully will illustrate both what we do, how we work with farmers, their communities, the land trusts or other nonprofits to protect and preserve farmland and working farms in perpetuity, and help you see some of what the tools. We use tools that you're familiar with, the ground lease, and we use tools that you may or not be as familiar with coming out of the conservation world, the easement models, but each get tweaked and adjusted to be applied to farmland. And so why is this needed? We're losing farms. We're losing farms very fast. We're losing the land.
to development, to other uses, and we're losing the farmers, we're losing the knowledge. Large percentage of farmers in the country are elderly, are getting to retirement age. It's hard for the young farmers to access the land when the farmers going out need money for retirement, and other people are buying up the land. So our food systems, the government subsidies, the way that we pay for and support food doesn't support small farmers integrated into our communities, supports agribusiness. And land is being used as for speculative value, and people are speculating and pushing up the cost of land. So those two forces are really important in what's happening. So development pressures and are making land in many places, development value is much higher than what farmers can afford to pay. And then even when we go in and we purchase those development rights, in many places, particularly right near those people who need to eat the food we want to produce, is exactly where the land prices are going up, because wealthy people, people who can afford second homes, people who are making their money on Wall Street or in the DC inside, you know, all these professions that are much more than farmers can buy second homes, retirement homes, and purchase farmland. So when we talk about preserving farms, we want to think about the land, and we want to preserve the land, but we want to preserve the farmer on the land too. And all the things, you don't get food from the land, you get food from a farmer on the land. And you don't get, it's only with the farmer there in a sustainable way that the soil gets preserved, the local economy gets supported, and the community has all those benefits from the farm. So what we see is, for a variety of reasons, there's gaps. There's a gap. The farmland has value to the farmer. The farmer can make money. It's a business. So that land's worth something to the farmer. That infrastructure that's on the farm, the house and everything, that's worth something. But there's very commonly, just as with housing, the gap between what your homeowner can pay and what the market will bear. We have the same thing. And sometimes the gap is huge. Sometimes the gap's 50% of the value. The farmer can only pay half of what the going rate is for the land, or less. So I'm going to quickly run through two stories, two examples of farms Equity Trust worked on in the last 10, 15 years, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, one that uses the ground lease, one that uses easements, and show how community interests get blended together, get matched with the farmer's personal interests, and not just the current farmer, the next farmer's interests, and how we try to create an ownership structure that addresses that suite of interests. And again, it's great talking to an audience that understands about shared ownership and pulling those different ownership elements apart, so I don't have to explain that to you. So the first story begins in Williamstown, Massachusetts, with Sam and Elizabeth, who were longtime farmers, had been farming, had taken an old dairy farm and turned it into diversified CSA farm, and were reaching retirement age. They wanted to see their farm continue. They didn't want it to be lost. They had spent their lives creating it. But they also needed some money, needed to be able to get out to retire. They needed to fund the rest of their life. The community, their CSA members and folks who ate the food from the farm, saw the end was in sight. If they could get a new farmer on the land, where were they going to get their vegetables? Where were they going to get their food? And where were they going to go on that Saturday with their kids to see where the food comes from and all of those other social benefits that you get from having a farm? So, meanwhile, we have Don and Bridget, who eventually became the incoming farmers. They were farming for a great nonprofit in eastern Massachusetts, the Food Project. They were mentioned earlier today. They partner with the Dudley Street Food Initiative, Dudley Street Initiative, and But he was a hired farmer. He didn't live on the land. They wanted to start a family. They wanted to raise their kids on the farm, but he was a commuting farmer. And he had no security, no job security. So if the board changed the mission or whatever, he would have to move on. So Don and Bridget, well, okay, so I just told you about them. And I said no housing, right? So here we are, the farm, the incoming farmers, the would-be incoming farmers, the would-be exiting farmers, and a community that wants their food. What do? Well, we want to get locally grown food for the community. We want to make sure this farm is going to be here now and into the future as a working farm. The community wants to have that contact I already mentioned, and we just have to keep it affordable. And the whole thing, the housing, the land. Massachusetts has an agricultural preservation program that it's a very good one actually, purchase of a conservation easement, and it has an agricultural restriction, requires farming on the land. But one of the problems in Massachusetts is we don't have the housing isn't included. So the housing gets cut off from the land and can be put up again by a state purchaser, and who can allocate the farm. So without telling the long story of the hard work that my predecessor, Ellie Cosmonopoulos, did, and the farmers did, and the years of talking it through and working on the details, I'll just jump to the outcome. The outcome was that the Williamstown Rural Lands Foundation, a local land conservation foundation, owns the land, owns the title to the land. Don and Bridget, the farmers, purchased the infrastructure. So they own the housing. It doesn't say there's one house. Sam and Elizabeth retired on the land. Part of what they got in the sale of the property, they took back in the form of a second house on the land. So they got to retire on the land. Massachusetts does have its conservation restriction on the agricultural portion of the land, everything except for what we call the building envelope, where the houses are and the other primary farm buildings. The land trust holds an option to purchase back the infrastructure, but as long as the farmers continue to farm the land, they have a 99-year renewable lease. And they hold that and their ownership of the infrastructure are linked in the lease. And they lease the land from the Rural Lands Foundation. So it was expensive. That was the whole point. So as you can see, the farm was a little over $1 million. Sam and Elizabeth, as I mentioned a moment ago, got part of the value back in a house that they could have on the land, and a big chunk of the money or the value. But it's still, they sold it at less than what they could have gotten in an open market, but they got to see the farm continue. The state APR money, that's the easement. The local land trust raised money. The CPA money that Gus mentioned a moment ago. The CSA raised $200,000, those are the members. And Don and Bridget purchased the right to farm the land and to live in the house for $177,000. So less than 20% of what it would have cost them to buy that on the open market and to own it outright. But the benefit doesn't stay with them. When they resell, they will have to resell under the restrictions of the lease. So there are active farming requirements in the lease, so they're required to keep farming on the land. They can't, retire from farming but stay living in the farmhouse. There are certain farming practices and expectations about farming so that the soil will be improved over time. The resale restrictions say the farmer has to sell to another qualified farmer, and the land trust holds an option to purchase so that they can intervene if there's a problem and bring it back to give to another farmer. The farmers have that 99-year inheritable lease. They can raise those kids on the farm. If they want, the kids can keep farming it. They own that infrastructure. They have the freedom to put up the fences or add that building or do the other things they need to do. And when they retire, they can get equity out. They won't get market rate that you could sell to an estate, but they can get what it's worth to a farmer so that they can have something if they want to go on and do something else. So the second farm that I want to talk about is Live Power Community Farm. This one was a little bit earlier. The Williamstown Caretaker Farm, that took place, I think they finished in 2006, and they worked on it for about 3 or 4 years prior to that. This one is one of the very first. Live Power is out in Covelo, California, up in Mendocino County. And this was, they began in the mid-90s. So Gloria and Stephen were farming on leased land, and the owner, they were biodynamic farmers. They were doing all their farming with horsepower. They had a CSA that sold partly in their region, in their local community, partly in some of the neighboring towns, and then about half the CSA is down in San Francisco. It's an area with really high land prices. So the farm's up to sell, but they didn't have the money to buy the farm. They had this really vibrant CSA that certainly wanted to see them continue. And especially as farmers, organic, biodynamic farmers, so committed to building the soil, building the long-term viability of this farm, to not have that kind of land tenure is just such a threat to them and to everything that they're doing. So again, the CSA took the lead and fundraised to purchase this farm. This one uses an enhanced conservation easement. It starts with the conservation easement and turns it into an agricultural conservation easement. So Stephen and Gloria own the land and the farm house structure, the whole thing, but there's an agricultural conservation easement that we own. Equity Trust is the holder of. There wasn't a local land trust that at that time was prepared to do this kind of work. And the easement requires, in this case, it's an income requirement. The way that you make sure the land's being farmed is, and this was the farmer's choice. You can do it as an income requirement, you can do it as a productivity requirement from the farm, but some way to say that this land is really being farmed. We have a measure. And so that they have to earn 50% or more of their income from farming the land. So we know they're really going to be there doing that. And there's an option to purchase. Equity Trust holds an option to purchase at agricultural value. And that's defined in the easement, how that will be, through an appraisal, the agricultural value, that allows us to ensure that if the land's not being farmed, or at the time of resale, that we can step in and put a farmer on the land who will farm. So it's ensured this will always be a working farm, just like the caretaker example. And in this case, the farmers really wanted to see the land farmed in a certain way. And so this farm is protected as a biodynamic or organic farm. I think that the farmers had to be persuaded to be broad like that. They had very fixed ideas, but people were concerned that that farming ideas might change. So you try to get the balance there. So again, resale restrictions in the easement say that when they're ready to sell, they have to sell their interest at appraised agricultural value, and so that ensures that the next farmer will be subject to the ground lease in the same way.
And is it heritable as well?
Well, they have title to it, so yes, they can inherit. So the purchase price, very different numbers, but same idea. So the easement value was $81,000, leaving $69,000 for the restricted agricultural value. And that's what's getting work. Well, that was a number of years ago, and it's a small farm, and it was pretty far north. I don't think you would get that now. Besides the marijuana growers are competing out there now. Go ahead.
This may be a naive question, but in both examples, there were significant monies raised by the CSA members. Was that a donation, or was there an actual quantified value out to those members? I mean, was it, they just wanted to see good done, or what was the exchange?
No, it was the CSA members. I mean, that's an interesting CSA, because that particular CSA, I don't know what different people's experiences are with CSAs, but some CSAs is pretty much just a pricing mechanism. You pay a certain amount, you think, well, that's what I'm paying for my vegetables, I just pay up front. This particular CSA is more traditional in that they look at the budget together with the farmer and they say, well, you need this and you need that, and how much can we afford to pay, and so on. But for the fundraising for the farm, this was above and beyond that, and it was just straight donations.
Okay.
It was
So it was sort of a charitable act.
Right. It was a charitable act that had certain repercussions for them,
Got it.
because it was in their community, so to speak.
Right, okay, thanks.
Yeah. And so again, we have, you're balancing the needs. That's what this is all about, is balancing these different sets of needs. The farmer's needs, the community's needs, the current needs, and the future needs, right? So land stewardship organization representing that wider community wants to preserve the natural environment and the open space, protect development, maintain that working landscape, the farm economy, the local food production, and maybe environmental education or other kinds of benefits. And the farmers are all for all of that, but they also want long-term land security, a place to live, something that they can leave their children, should the children be interested in that. The independence to run their own business. This is a big thing that you get into a lot, and we can maybe question and answer time, is when we think about, oh, we're working together to preserve the land, so we should all be farmers, or we should all manage the farm, or tell the farmer what to do, and that's not necessarily the best model. And farmers have done a good job over the years managing their own businesses, and I certainly would encourage people to allow them to continue that in many cases. Privacy of the home, and the ability farmers want to be able to invest in the land and put their energy into improving the land.
On your first example, you said the original owners, did they build a new house, or did someone buy it, or was it already
They had actually, a few years before, they had built a small house. As they were getting older, they were looking to have help on the farm, and they were thinking about transition. So they wanted to have, they actually had a couple different young farmers come in, and there was that smaller house, there was the big old farmhouse, and there was the smaller house that the young farmers, apprentice farmers, could live in. And Don and Bridget lived there for a while, and they ended up swapping houses. And so Don and Bridget moved to the big house, and, so that they could get breakfast to the crew or whatever, and Sam and Elizabeth could use the little house as their retirement place. So in that particular case, they had the space, they had already built them. So, two models, similar outcomes. The structure is different, the ownership structure is different, but they're designed to basically try to do the same thing. Under the conservation easement, the farmer owns that fee interest in the property, but is subject to restrictions of the easement, and the land trust holds that easement and the option to purchase. And then you just flip it around with the ground lease, and you all are familiar with that. So the land trust owns the fee interest in the land, sells the improvements, and together with that lease, right, 99-year lease.
So I'm wondering, in the ground lease arrangement, the first example, the farmers do not own the land. You said that they got the infrastructure, and I'm wondering if that includes farm equipment, because I'm not a farmer, but my understanding is if you're a farmer and you need, equipment costs are very expensive, your land is your equity when you go to borrow the money to buy the tractor and all of that. So does that put them in a difficult position?
A couple things. First of all, not having had to outlay so much money for the land in the first place, they don't need to rely on it so much as equity, because, if they could afford to buy the land to then use mortgage against the equipment, it's the same thing, then they can afford the equipment. But you can, just as with CLT housing, they could, and I believe in their case they got a mortgage to purchase the house itself. And I think in this case, there was an outgoing farmer, the sale, to be honest, I don't remember whether the farm equipment was just packaged in, or if that was a side deal, but there was a transfer of equipment as well.
There would also be a value to the leasehold from a borrower's perspective. And we work with many young farmers where what they're doing is, first they're building capital by getting some animals, getting some equipment before they get to ownership. So that's not an unusual kind of a situation for you.
Yeah, and there are a lot of government programs that will do that. Federal government for specifically for young farmer loans, beginning farmer loans. So they're used to working with people in those situations. So I mean, this is basically the same thing. These are some of the elements that are both types of agreement: land use limitations, environmental stewardship, farmer security, farmer freedom, community access, and each agreement that we do, each project that we work on, and we've done a few of our own, and then we help other organizations do these kinds of projects. Everyone is different. You know, every farm is different, every community is different. Exactly how you work it out, but the bones of the structures, you know, tend to be very similar. And these are some of the points you really have to be thinking about. About the buildings and infrastructure, about how to build, how much equity they can build. The same thing as you have with housing, and the transfer, how that transfer is going to work. What are the rules for that? So. So that's the end of the piece about farming. There's a one-page, well, two-sided handout that you have that covers the same material in a slightly different format, but that's referenced. And then we have, for the longer version, is this manual that Equity Trust has published. I've got one copy here. I've got flyers about it. And should I just take 5 minutes on Southside Community Land Trust? Yeah. So, I mentioned earlier how it's kind of fun, just sort of intellectually, to talk to people coming, you know, who are from the CLT side of things rather than the Conservation Land Trust. But I also want to say that for us, you know, we're a small organization. We work around the country, and we really, a big part of what we do is facilitate these kinds of projects for other organizations. We provide technical assistance, and we have model leases and model easements that are available from our website. So I'll make a little plug that we'd be the next thing where we'd like to go is into urban areas. And we'd like to start looking at how these models can be shifted or adapted to getting long-term or permanent access to land in urban areas, particularly in food-poor communities. And we love to, I mainly we mainly work with Conservation Land Trust because they're the ones out there looking at the farmland, but we would be very excited to start doing more work with community land trusts. So those of you who were at Urban Ag got a lot of great stories about what's going on with in a lot of cities around the country about community gardening, urban farming, and that sort of thing. I just wanted to show a few quick slides from an interesting hybrid organization, Southside Community Land Trust in Providence. I was just talking, I found something that John Davis didn't know about. He had never heard of them. They've been around for 30 years, and they're called a community land trust. But they're neither nor. They do land preservation. They don't do any housing. They work in the south side of Providence, and what they did was they took, you know, kind of like Dudley Street neighborhood, started with a totally burnt out neighborhood, and they've gone in and really helped change the face of that neighborhood by taking these empty lots that were full of garbage and you know, where everyone dumped their stuff from all over Rhode Island, and turning it into a bunch of neat things. They have a city farm where they do demonstration, teach people about farming, they grow food, they sell it at those city markets, they give it to the food banks and the soup kitchens, they have youth programs, many things like that. They have a community growers network. They themselves have established, I don't remember how many, 13, 20, or not, I don't remember the number, community gardens. And then there are other community gardens that other groups have established, and they have a network for them all and do a lot of support work for them. And it's very interesting. There's a whole range of relationships with the land that go from, they have state-purchased agricultural easements on some of their plots of land. They have state-purchased conservation easements. So those pieces are protected in perpetuity. In other cases, they have a 5-year or 10-year lease with the city. And in other cases, it's year to year, just because the land's vacant with a hospital or some city land or something. So it's this whole suite of relationships. And then the gardens are managed by the community gardeners, and there's a whole process, a community organizing piece to this, and then the gardens all have garden leaders that are chosen by the gardeners, and everyone that's there has to contribute on work days and so on. So it's an interesting model. It's got much more community in it than the conservation land trusts do, but they have a more traditional nonprofit board. They don't have the biotech board. But mainly I just wanted to say that, you know, this is a space, sorry. So this is the type of thing that a community land trust could bring some really great skills and knowledge to, and bring in those other pieces that they don't have, and the conservation land trusts don't have, but they could, to ensure ongoing community control. We don't know what we want this land to. We assume we very well might want it to be producing food 100 years from now, because we'll still all be eating, right? Or someone will be. But, you know, the community should be the ones who are deciding. And I think, to my mind, it should be both the members of the garden and the people who live near the garden and aren't farming in the garden, just like we do with housing, right? The people who live there and the people who abut it. So again, I think it's a great opportunity for, and they also have, and this is another thing that community land trusts can be thinking about, they have an urban edge farm. So this is actually just outside the city, on some state land with mid-term lease. They have little micro farms, about I think 5 or 7 farmers. A number of them are immigrants from various parts of the world, just as their community gardening is heavily populated by immigrants from Liberia, from Laos, from places all over the world. And this urban edge farm, they're commercial farms, small-scale commercial farms, close to the city, aiming their production at that city population. Oftentimes, their own communities, their own ethnic communities, they're growing the foods that the people would like from the land.
Just a quick question. What kind of size are you talking about in terms of a city farm or an urban edge farm? Like how many acres?
Right. Their so-called city farm is tiny. It's about 1 acre, I think. And the urban edge farm, I want to say they're each of these 5 or 7 are farming 4 or 5 acres apiece. I'm sorry, I should have made sure.
I think the Tacoma Housing Authority, in their neighborhood, they have a farm really similar, and 1 acre farm that, like you're describing.
We have community gardens. It's not a farm. It's not a CLT model.
But it's a neat piece of it. I mean, it's like they're coexisting already, it seems like.
Well, one thing that works well in Los Angeles County, simply because of our school district, Los Angeles Unified School District, is having community learning gardens that the CLT and the school, the particular school, share through the district, so that the students have a chance to learn about farming and things. And during school hours, it's restricted to school children's use and the school people. And then after school hours and weekends and summers when school's not in session, it's strictly for the community. And that really works very well. And the CLTs are the ones doing that with the school districts for the various schools in the county.
That's great.
So that's an option to consider. And it's really an excellent way for city kids to have some idea of what it means to grow things.
A farm we work with in California is doing partnerships with some of the urban schools to both bring the kids out to the farm, but then bring the farm back to the school and set up those school community gardens. So
And what's really been great is in a lot of cases, especially when it's been a middle school or where kids are too young to drive and where they wanted to get them to cut back on the size of the parking lot and create the garden, and that we've done that successfully, and that's really good. It's the only time you have an issue about parking spaces when the teachers and the high school students drive. When you have middle schools and younger, you don't need.
Right, oh, that's great. So the final thing I want to say is people talk a lot about partnerships and using your strength and combining them with other organizations' strengths. So I just wanted to again emphasize that to me, you know, doing this work and spending a lot of time convincing land trust boards that it's okay. It's not scary to own the farm that someone's going to live on and work on. It's not such a scary thing. And I think that I'd love to see, again, I'd love to bring community land trusts into those kind of conversations to help us encourage conservation land trusts either to do it, embrace it, or to say, hey, we could do that. You know, if you're close enough to our community land trust that we could be the steward of the farmhouse in some way. And all the stuff, I won't repeat what I said earlier, the experience with the shared ownership models and so on. But conservation land trusts, if you are thinking about getting into farmland or urban or rural farmland preservation, conservation land trusts make great partners and bring other ways of doing things. They have lots of knowledge just about the land. They know how to look at land. They know how to think about land and the value of land. They understand the concept of permanence, which is another thing that sometimes you have trouble in helping people think, what do we mean when we say perpetuity? We really mean it. And systems and procedures, very good procedures for stewardship and access to different kinds of funding. And I would point you as well on this topic, if the CLT Reader has a whole section on Beyond Housing that with stories about Troy Yarden and various other things. In the work that we do, sometimes there are zoning issues. In general, some kinds of worker housing are typically accepted and normal in most farming areas, but getting funding for it and getting and being able to make it adequate is often a challenge.
Rural development does have a number of programs. This doesn't get to the zoning issues for farm labor housing. Yeah.
Just saying,
Yep.
USDA is completely outside of King County now, except Maple Valley, way off.
Right. When urban areas farming, it's a whole education thing and legislative.
Yeah. And the housing issue is also one that we've had to deal with in our farm program, because for a long time farms were getting bigger, and now with the kind of renaissance in local foods, farms are getting smaller again. So if we conserve the 600-acre farm with just one housing unit, and its future is really as 3 farms or 5 farms, it's an issue that we are trying to deal with now. And
Right before the crash, our state rolled out it's called Husky Farmer, something like that, really creative name. But it's for those, it's for those suburbanites wishing to become farmers. So it's for first-time farmers, small tract only, half it for 5 or 10 acres. So it's not working very well just because of timing, but I think that it perhaps has some implications working with the land trust.
Actually, are you talking about through the Finance Commission?
Yeah.
They won't work with Land Trust yet on that.
Well,
It's
I
a
know
bond, the
that.
Aggie bond program.
Yeah.
Yeah, they actually, IRS-wise, they can't.
Ah.
Because it's funded differently than the Finance Commission's housing program. But, I mean, that doesn't mean we can't get them to change how it's funded.
Right,
But the way
exactly.
the way it's funded, they actually can, so.
Yeah, I'll get it done. This time.
Yes.
I'm having trouble picturing this model for something that's not a small-scale organic farm in a kind of liberal bent state. I'm looking at the Galford, North Dakota, coming from Iowa, Minnesota, larger ag states like that, especially now where land values are at all-time high prices. Beans are selling for $15 a bushel, corn's at $8. How is this working in areas like that?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's been, this model has been focused.
Down the price even of larger farms. We have to make a bigger upfront investment for that ag affordability option, but it means that the farm can transfer to another farmer at a price that the farmer will still cash flow.
With state programs, I think, without the government involved, it's always going to be small scale.
Yes.
Are you seeing any collaborative efforts that you're talking about? Kind of what I call inclusionary zoning for all these different pieces.
No, I've seen a lot of, I guess I've seen a lot of innovative partnerships, you know, that go kind of in a strip mall location, where their site had been developed as a strip mall, but it's on the main street in town. They tore that down, moved the building to the front, and then condoed the building, and the city let the land trust build the upper 2 floors as affordable housing. And they're actually, for your interest, using a heat recovery system from all the coolers to help heat the whole building. So we're seeing innovative partnerships. We're seeing a lot of housing in the arts projects. There's one other supermarket project that we're doing, that we did back up in Richford. We're co-locating with health centers. But zoning in particular has really been more like a lot of community education about what produces both good housing and good conservation. And it's just something that's kind of continual work.
The one thing that I would add that not specifically the work we're doing, but there's the whole movement is more being driven by the local food movement and movement. Lots of cities now permitting the raising of chickens and other small livestock, and cities are embracing community gardens and so on. That's not commercial though. But,
Well, part of the reason I asked is that we actually were just involved with a university project for City of Edmonds here in Washington, where we designed for them a form-based code, and within it, this neighborhood was a special district, and they wanted to be known as a garden, produce area, designated area of their community, and they wanted that to be built into the zoning and have some of the land, open space land, be designated for that, and have that be considered an active, invigorating thing for their neighborhood. And so we were able to write that right into the code for them. So I just thought that might be along with affordable housing and other things as well. So kind of mixing all that at the code level.
a lot of the places we work are we as I said, I'm interested in doing more work right in cities and right in urban areas. A lot of times we're outside and we're in where we work in Massachusetts in the word just went out of my head, but communities where farming is a right. Farming already exists by right in the zoning code.
Any of you have other thoughts about partnerships that we ought to be trying to encourage? Yes?
The Community Food Security Coalition, for sure. I went to their conference. They have a conference coming up in Oakland at the beginning next week, actually. But I went to the conference last year in New Orleans and was really surprised by how much they were talking about land grabbing in urban areas like Detroit and Flint, Michigan, and about community gardeners losing their land and having to, you know, there was a lot of talk, we've got to figure out this land thing, we've got to figure out how to get ownership of our land. And I was like, no, you don't. We already figured it out, you just need to talk to us. So, you know, I think they're very focused on food security and food sovereignty. They're actually trying to become more inclusive of rural communities. They've had a large urban focus up until now. So.
Other thoughts? We do have evaluations being passed around.
But, we've found partners with some of the public entities in the state of Washington. Airports are by and large run by port districts, which are taxing districts. But those also encompass a lot, where we are, it's a lot of buffer space that is old traditional farmland. So we've just begun to go back to leasing that land because they don't want any houses there because airplanes, but at the same time we've been able to turn that around and lease it back to farmers who don't own any land.
That's terrific.
Where did you say that?
That's on Lopez Island, but the other ports up there in that area have looked into it. I mean, there's a lot of vacant land that we can't do anything with, really.
Yes.
And I know in Portland, they've got, in an affordable housing development, they have their community gardens on Burlington Northern property. Because it cannot, if they have a tunnel, a railroad tunnel underneath it, so they can never build on that land, but it's perfect for community gardens. So they just get the use of it, so it enhances the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think there are also groups that I know outside of the Bay Area that have been just working with landowners who have land that's way underutilized and helping make it available to people who actually want to make it more productive than just hay or whatever its current use is. So there's that kind of work going on too. Yeah.
One of our architects on the housing board is looking at a large chunk of land in Renton in Southern County that their housing authority is interested in. There's a big immigrant farm community down there. We're looking at doing some affordable housing and community land trust housing spots on the site and partnering with the county. It's in very early conception stage. She's working really hard to get a lot of people to the table, but I really love some of the tools you've offered because I have a real vision as a former farmer and mindless farmer, particularly about going down and trying to get some really innovative series of both housing and land use models using co-housing, community land trusts, and land conservation. I think it's exciting that all these models are starting to talk to each other because we can innovate some pretty exciting stuff. So it's about 26 acres. We'll see what can be done with it.
We have some interesting activities going on in what is called Albuquerque South Valley, which is south of Albuquerque. Some of it's in the city, some of it's in the county area. It's very close to the water table, it's right by the river. They have a lot of flooding issues, and so they've created this thing, it's been around for a while, called the Albuquerque Metro Area Flood Control Association of AMFCA. And so they own these parcels for which when the stormwater surge is too large, they pump excess water into these areas. They're like detention ponds, they call them surge areas. They're a little distinct from detention ponds and how they function. And they're just big flat areas, and they basically just pump it out over this broad area. Someone had the brilliant idea near this charter high school. It's an area that's still rich in agricultural activity to farm on, and they let them do it. So it's a weird, it's this agency that owns this land. So it's not quite just going to the county and saying, hey, you got this open space that's being underutilized. But someone saw that opportunity, and it's pretty exciting what they're doing down there.
The other thing that's popping in Vermont now are what are called food hubs. And again, if you come to Burlington next year, the Intervale is kind of a national model of what was once wasteland that's been reclaimed for farmland. And I think we now have a total of 4 food hubs organized around the state, providing opportunities as kind of incubator farms for young farmers and providing access to food for people in the local community as opposed to whatever the Shaws or a major supermarket might be providing. thank you guys very much. This was a great discussion.